Welcome back, viewers, to the latest researches and news. Currently, we have two updates that together reveal the full strategic picture of where this conflict is heading. Firstly, we will update you about what is Ethiopia's next military move. After the fighting at Shirena, the Ethiopian National Defense Force is under pressure to respond. We break down the three realistic options and which one analysts believe is most likely to come first. And secondly, about Eritrean officials, including military representatives, crossed into eastern Tigray in broad daylight to attend a community gathering near the border. Addis Ababa is furious. What this visit actually signals and why the timing is no coincidence. Let us be clear up front. There is no official confirmation from the Ethiopian government or the Ethiopian National Defense Force about what their next military step will be. What we are doing here is analysis examining the realistic options available to the government and what each would mean in practice. After the recent fighting at Shirena, where Tigray Defense Force and Ethiopian National Defense Force clashed, drones were deployed by both sides and casualties were taken, the Ethiopian military command faces a specific kind of institutional pressure. When an army experiences a confrontation that results in casualties and draws public attention, its commanders feel pressure to demonstrate that they have not lost the initiative, that they remain in control. That inaction is not the response. This is not just military logic, it is also political logic. Abiy Ahmed's government cannot afford to appear passive in the face of what it has framed to the public as Tigray Defense Force aggression. So a response is expected. The question is what form it takes. Option 1. Expanding the conflict toward neighboring countries. This would mean taking the fight beyond Ethiopia's borders, engaging Sudan or Eritrea directly, or taking actions on Sudanese or Eritrean soil. Analysts assess this as the least likely near-term choice, not because it is unthinkable, but because of the scale of the risk. Opening additional international fronts would mean fighting on multiple sovereign borders simultaneously. It would dramatically stretch the Ethiopian National Defense Force's already strained resources, and it would draw in the international community in ways that domestic military operations do not. This option exists on the table, but the cost-benefit calculation makes it the least likely first response. Option 2. A large-scale ground offensive into Tigray. A major ground push infantry, armor, artillery moving north from the Ethiopian National Defense Forces positions along the A2 highway into Tigray Defense Force controlled territory. This is the option that would most directly address the Shirena front and the broader question of who controls Western Tigray. But history is a very powerful constraint here. The 2020 offensive into Tigray began as a large-scale ground operation. It initially succeeded. Mekelle fell within weeks. And then the Tigray Defense Force regrouped, reorganized, and came back. By 2021, the Ethiopian National Defense Force was retreating from positions it had taken. The war lasted 2 more years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives before the Pretoria Agreement. Any Ethiopian National Defense Force commander proposing a large-scale ground offensive into Tigray right now knows that history. They know Tigray Defense Force is better prepared than it was in 2020. They know Tigray Defense Force has air defense installations, reorganized armies on the Raya front, and an Eritrean partner that was not aligned with Tigray in the last war. A ground offensive is possible, but it is costly, historically proven to be difficult to sustain, and politically dangerous if it produces visible casualties quickly. Option 3. Air power and drone strikes first. This is the option that most military analysts consider the most likely first response. Before committing ground forces, use the air. Drone strikes and air attacks on Tigray Defense Force military infrastructure, logistics facilities, supply routes, weapon storage, and command-related targets. This approach allows the Ethiopian National Defense Force to demonstrate action and inflict damage without immediately committing large numbers of ground troops to a front where the terrain and the opponent's preparation both favor defense. It also preserves the flexibility to escalate to ground operations if the air campaign achieves its objectives, or to de-escalate if political pressure demands it. Tigray Defense Forces drone capability, which we reported on in our last update, is now a factor in this calculation as well. The Ethiopian National Defense Force knows that an aerial campaign may now face aerial response. Tigray Defense Forces air defense installations and its own drone capability mean the era of one-sided air dominance may be behind us. What happens in the coming days will tell us which path the Ethiopian National Defense Force has chosen. The fighting at Shirena has created the pressure. The response will reveal the strategy, now to a development that is being interpreted very differently depending on which side you are on. A delegation of Eritrean officials, including military representatives and local administrators from Eritrea's Senafe subzone and the Zalambesa area, crossed into eastern Tigray during daylight hours. They attended a public community gathering near the border. Local Tigray administrators received them. Images and videos from the event circulated online, including footage of Eritrean security personnel accompanying the delegation into Ethiopian territory. Let us explain each element of this because the details matter. Who attended? The delegation included officials from Senafe and Zalambesa. These are areas of Eritrea that sit along the Eritrea-Tigray border, directly adjacent to the communities on the Tigray side. These are not central government officials from Amhara making a state visit. These are border area administrators, people whose communities have historical, cultural, and family connections with Tigrayan border communities across the line. But the presence of military representatives alongside them gives the visit a security dimension that goes beyond community relations. Where they went. Eastern Tigray inside Ethiopian territory without any clearance from or notification to the Ethiopian federal government in Addis Ababa. This is the critical political point. Eritrean officials do not have the right to enter Ethiopian territory without the consent of the Ethiopian government. That is basic international protocol. And they did it anyway, openly, in daylight, with cameras present. What the gathering was about. The event focused on themes of cross-border cooperation, community unity, and shared relations the language of the SIMDO framework that Tigray People Liberation Front and Eritrea have been building. The gathering was essentially a public, community-level demonstration of the Tigray-Eritrea political and social alignment that has been developing behind the scenes. How the Ethiopian National Defense Force and Ethiopian federal government have responded. Ethiopian federal authorities have previously and consistently criticized this type of cross-border contact, arguing that any interaction between foreign officials and Tigray's administration on Ethiopian soil without Addis Ababa's authorization constitutes a violation of Ethiopian sovereignty. This argument has particular force given that Eritrea and Ethiopia have had a complicated and historically adversarial relationship, and given that Eritrea is now aligned with the political and military structure that Ethiopia is in conflict with. How Tigray's Tigray People Liberation Front administration has framed it. The Tigray People Liberation Front government in Mekelle argues that maintaining cross-border community relations is not a violation of anything. It is a humanitarian and economic necessity for a region that is still recovering from war and is surrounded by international borders. Border communities have family members, shared grazing lines, and economic interdependencies that do not neatly follow political lines. What the timing means. This visit happened immediately after the Shirena confrontation, after the Ethiopian National Defense Force deployed drones against Tigray Defense Force positions, after Tigray People Liberation Front declared war had started. In that context, Eritrean officials walking into Tigray openly is not a community relations exercise. It is a political signal. It says, Eritrea is present. Eritrea's relationship with Tigray is active and public, and Eritrea is not afraid of how Addis Ababa interprets that presence. From the Ethiopian National Defense Forces perspective, this visit is deeply alarming because it confirms in the most visible way possible that the political relationship described by the SEMDO framework is not theoretical. Eritrean officials are physically inside Tigray with Eritrean security personnel meeting with Tigray administrators at exactly the moment when Ethiopian National Defense Force and Tigray Defense Force are exchanging drone strikes on the border. That is not a coincidence of timing. That is a coordinated message. Two stories tonight, both pointing toward the same conclusion. The Ethiopian National Defense Force is under pressure to respond to the Shirena confrontation, and the most likely first response is an air and drone campaign targeting Tigray Defense Force infrastructure and supply routes. A ground offensive remains possible but costly. Expanding to neighboring countries carries risks the government is unlikely to accept in the near term. And while Ethiopia's military planners are working through those options, Eritrean officials walked into Tigray in broad daylight with cameras rolling. Cross-border cooperation between Eritrea and Tigray's Tigray People Liberation Front government is no longer something that needs to be inferred or speculated about. It is being shown publicly. The SEMDO alliance is not hidden. It is not denied. It is being demonstrated in community gatherings, in the presence of Eritrean security personnel on Tigrayan soil, in drone capabilities that Tigray Defense Force did not have in the last war. Ethiopia's next move will matter, but so will Eritrea's decision about how openly to stand with Tigray and how far that openness goes. We will keep watching every development as it emerges. Like, share, and subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss an update.